Two of biotech's biggest names are bringing the disease interception model to cardiovascular risk with a startup that's made its debut today. We'll discuss Coursera from John Maraganore and Clive Meanwell on the latest BioCentury This Week podcast. Plus, FDA has been quietly positioning itself to disrupt the childhood vaccine schedule. We'll hear the latest from our Washington editor, Steve Usden, on what is happening at FDA, as well as changes to the Medicare drug negotiation program. And we have Simone back, and she has been dedicated to her U.S. Open viewing, and she'll give us an update on the big Coco Naomi showdown that happened over in, where do they hold that thing? Queens, Brooklyn? Who knows? I got a bone up on my tennis. I'm Jeff Cranmer, executive editor here at BioCentury and host of the BioCentury This Week podcast. And joining me today are
Simone Fishburne, editor-in-chief.
Steve Usden, Washington editor.
And Paul Bonanos, director of Biopharma Intelligence.
All right. Thanks for joining me, peeps. Two veteran biotech leaders are launching a new company with ambitions in the CV disease space. You talked to them, Paul. Tell us what you learned.
Sure. So yeah, the story broke this morning, and I had a chance to catch up last week with John Maraganore and Clive Meanwell. You mentioned them both. Obviously, both have been around a long time. I think most people know John was co-founder and CEO of Alnylam, led the company for a very long time before handing off his roles a few years ago. And Clive was CEO of the Medicines Co., which Novartis acquired for about $10 billion a few years back. So these two people have worked together before. The Medicines Co. buyout centered on a drug we now know as Leqvio, also known as inclisiran, that targets PCSK9 to treat high cholesterol. It originated with Alnylam, Medicines Co. licensed it, and now it's Novartis's to sell. There's also a connection further back, going back to 1997. Maraganore was an inventor of a thrombin inhibitor, Angiomax, aka bivalirudin, which Medicines Co. brought to market via a partnership. So what they're up to now, they've launched a cardiovascular health startup called Coursera Health, and it has two things going on. One is a dual-acting RNAi therapy that also targets PCSK9 like inclisiran, also targets angiotensinogen to treat high blood pressure. You may recognize the second target from another Alnylam program, zilebesiran, that's in late-stage clinical testing. And Coursera's program is headed into the clinic this year. The other thing they have is a risk evaluation tool that's intended to identify people who are more likely to develop CV disease and find them earlier in life rather than sort of wait for them to get diagnosed. It's a software tool. It uses AI in some component. We didn't get too far into the details of how the software works, but John described it as an algorithmic tool that assesses risk of developing CV disease. It's not a diagnostic, and just to be clear, it's not a companion diagnostic that goes with the therapy, but it's a way to figure out early on how much risk a person has of developing CV disease, and then the person and their doctor can come up with a treatment strategy, which may or may not include Coursera's therapy. And this is, as you mentioned, in the category of disease interception. We've written about that before some, too.
Let me ask you about that, and maybe ask Steve as well, because I think it's likely that we're just going to see more and more of tools like these AI tools maybe launched along with a company. Now, you pointed out that this is not a companion diagnostic. So, Steve, do regulators care about this? Is this something that just exists only in the commercial space? How do you look at that?
Regulators do care about it. Regulators around the world, not just FDA, are trying to get their arms around those kinds of tools and to think about how to regulate them. The potential is enormous, and the challenges are also substantial, because if you think about it, unlike just about any other product, it's protean, right? It's going to keep changing. The AI changes as it learns more. So how do you regulate something that isn't going to be the same 2 days in a row? That's a challenge. I think a lot of the regulation around it is going to depend on the kinds of decisions that are made based on it. I think regulators around the world, they're settling on a risk-based different kinds of risk-based frameworks for these AI tools, where the amount of regulation, the amount of scrutiny is going to be highly dependent on the consequences of the decisions that are made based on them. And there's also going to have to be an ongoing monitoring of safety issues, both by the companies that manufacture, that make the AI tools, and by providers that use them. Yeah, we're going to see a lot more of this, and we're going to see a lot more kind of experimentation around the world about regulatory frameworks for those kinds of tools.
Paul, I have a question for you as well, because, John Maraganore, we've spoken to him obviously over the years, and he's been one of the forward thinkers really in terms of pricing models, innovative pricing models, wondering whether he talked to you about the payer aspect. I'm assuming that he believes that payers will want this kind of information. And is that part of the company's thesis?
Well, I should mention they stressed that there is no business model yet around the tool, the AI tool. And on the therapeutic side, the path is much more well-defined. It's not clear yet how it will shake out for reimbursement, I would say. It is not unprecedented as well, though. We should mention Provention Bio and Tzield, teplizumab, which is the approved therapy to delay onset of type 1 diabetes. And I think it's been pretty clear that there is a market for something like that. It may just be a very slow-growing one. That's a therapy that Sanofi paid $2.9 billion to acquire, and sales of the product are now, in the first half of this year, were 29 million euro, about 34 million US. So there is a path to market for a disease interception for people who aren't sick yet, but I don't think it's clear how reimbursement will work for something like Coursera's therapy. I'm drawing the comparison, but it's two very different situations, right? I mean, type 1 diabetes, delaying onset of type 1 diabetes is a much smaller indication than CV disease, pretty much the biggest killer in the world, right? So how far will people go? How far will regulators or payers go to establish this commercial path, and for whom? And it's up to the company to sort of make the market and create the market for something like this. It's very different from treating disease that already exists.
So just one last word, Paul, about the therapy itself. Is this effectively going to now be a competitor to inclisiran, to Leqvio?
Could be, yes. And the idea is to simplify by, instead of having two administrations, to have one. It could be competitive. Obviously, the timelines are quite different, Leqvio being on the market and this one just now entering the clinic. And it's also not clear whether this will be chiefly prescribed to people to stave off disease or to go to people who are already entering cardiovascular disease later in life.
All right. Thanks for that, Paul. Paul's story. The latest in our emerging company profile series is up on BioCentury.com. You can also find it at the link in the show notes. And we are going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back to talk about what is going on in Washington.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe. Grand Rounds, BioCentury's R&D conference, will make its European debut in 2025. Join us to debate key translational bottlenecks and unlock scientific breakthroughs with commercial potential. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore cutting-edge advancements in early-stage R&D as we dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Join us for the inaugural BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe in Cambridge, UK, the September 17th to 19th. Register and learn more at biocenturygrandroundseurope.com.
Well, it is back to school time at last on the US East Coast, and for us at BioCentury, for the past 33 years, that means publishing our signature issue of the year, and that is called Back to School. It's a forward-looking package that looks at a broad issue critical to the biopharma industry, and this year, Steve, one-man show. Well, of course, you had some crack editors. Steve, give us a quick teaser.
Basically, what I did this year is I said, look, imagine that you're starting with a blank sheet of paper and you're creating an optimal medical products regulator for the United States. how would you go about doing it? And I talked to a lot of people at FDA, former FDA people, CEOs of biopharma companies, academics, and came up with a prescription. And I'll be the first person to say that it isn't definitive. It isn't the last word. It's really intended to spark a discussion, a debate about how FDA should be reorganized. A couple of the points that I make, I suggest that FDA's medical product regulation function should be separated from its other functions. In other words, what's now the Center for Biologics, the Center for Drugs, and the Center for Devices should be separated from tobacco, cosmetics, veterinary products. And I also suggest that the medical products regulation should be oriented and should be organized around clinical outcomes, around clinical functions, and suggest that the Oncology Center of Excellence should be a model for how medical products regulation in the United States should be organized. But as you said, it's a big package. There's 7 stories. There's a lot more to it. I hope that listeners take the time to read the package, respond to it, think about it. You'll also have the opportunity to listen and watch Simone and I talk about it on the BioCentury show later this week.
And that is our sister podcast, available in audio and video form on BioCentury's YouTube channel. And we did do Back to School a little differently this year. Traditionally, as I said, we really release it around the U.S. Labor Day holiday. This year, we released it in mid-August, and we will hear from Simone in a letter from the editor this week, and that will contain links to all 7 stories, and of course, you'll have the podcast as well. Now, this time of year is also a time of year very special to Simone. The U.S. Open happening in Flushing Meadows, New York. I always get a vision of Homer Simpson's trip to Manhattan and the greater New York area, where he wanders through Flushing Meadows, and it's a really iconic scene. But Simone, Skinner, the Joker, Alcaraz, who do you think's going to take it this year?
Sinner, I think.
Sinner? Oh.
Yeah. So, Jeff,
that's because Principal Skinner on Simpsons. It was a little slip there.
So, I always try to find like a theme that's relevant to biotech. And I think this year I want to go with resilience. Okay. So one of the standout matches was Naomi Osaka against Coco Gauff. Naomi Osaka, you've got to root for her, if only because she has, as several others have, she's had a child and come back since then, which is very difficult to do in tennis. And Coco is a local favorite. But, I go to the resilience thing because to really reach the top, you got to go through a lot of failures. There's this very famous commencement speech by Roger Federer from last year where he talks about, even though he won like 80% of his matches, he won only 54% of his points or something. So there's a lot of loss and failure that goes on. And I guess that's what CEOs need to do in biotech right now. They just need to keep picking themselves up and going at it again. I know that Steve feels like that a little bit as he watches the FDA undergo massive changes. That agency is going to require a little bit of resilience. So I don't know if you guys want to pick that up and add the thread there, but you don't get anywhere in our industry without being able to take a few losses and then still pick yourself up and keep going at it.
Well, we will head there in a second. I need to hear who your men's winner is going to be.
Alcaraz.
I love that man.
Just going to watch the hair grow back. He did the buzz cut thing. That's maybe it. Maybe, Steve, you need the buzz cut.
Well, a lot of the teenagers today, I can say as the father of a 15-year-old boy, mullets have come back. And I really question.
Do you think at BioCentury we should just give people a choice, mullet or buzz cut? That's it?
Well, the idea
guys,
Yeah. Well, the idea of the mullet is business in the front and party in the back. So when you're on Zoom, people won't even know if you've got a mullet if you do it properly.
Man, when I was a kid, it was like mohawks, and you could do the Robert Smith of the Cure hair and all that stuff. But
don't even go there. I'm like of the big hair 80s and early 90s kind of.
All right, I like it. I like it. Well, Steve, a lot of talk last week about the turmoil at CDC. It was in the media spotlight, but As you were mentioning to me, sort of a quieter but potentially more consequential drama was also unfolding last week at FDA. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah. So like you say, the turmoil at CDC, firing the director, 3 top scientists resigning, it got a lot of attention, quite rightly. So did FDA's narrowing of the approvals of COVID vaccines. But there's something that was really important that flew under the radar. In his decision memo about the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID vaccine, CBER Director Vinay Prasad precluded co-administration of the COVID vaccine with flu or RSV vaccines. This was a big deal for 2 reasons, one affecting Pfizer and COVID, and the other, I think, potentially having even bigger impacts. So before Prasad's decision, CBER staff had given Pfizer the green light to include co-administration of flu and RSV on its label. And the reason we know that, besides the fact that people at FDA told me that, is that Pfizer has already printed labels and inserted them in hundreds of thousands of cartons of vaccines saying that the vaccine can be co-administered with flu and RSV vaccines. So Prasad's decision could have forced Pfizer to rip open every carton and replace the labels. This would have disrupted distribution just as shipments were starting for the fall season when respiratory infections surge. Pfizer got FDA to agree instead to the company sending letters to healthcare providers telling them not to co-administer the vaccines. And that letter is posted on FDA's website. Prasad didn't cite any evidence that co-administering is not safe or effective. Rather, he said that he isn't persuaded by the evidence supporting it. And he said that evidence is based on non-inferiority studies with confidence intervals that he thinks are too permissive. The interesting thing is that CDC and a number of academic groups have looked into the same issue. They've conducted studies, and the studies that they've conducted, according to CDC, the American College of Physicians, Infectious Diseases Society of America, show that it's safe and effective to co-administer the COVID vaccines with the flu and RSV vaccines. So, kind of Pfizer dodged a bullet there. It remains to be seen what the impact is going to be on the season's uptake of flu and RSV vaccines. It's a whole lot more convenient for people to get them all at one time than it is in 3 different times. I think that uptake of the COVID vaccine is going to be extraordinarily low this year anyway, for a variety of reasons, including the narrowed indication that FDA has approved. Okay, so then you say, well, what's the bigger picture, right? So the bigger picture is that Prasad made it clear that his concern about co-administration isn't limited to COVID vaccines. FDA Commissioner Marty Makary, HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. have repeatedly said that they're skeptical of the childhood vaccine schedule, that they don't believe children need as many vaccines as they receive, and that the vaccination should be spaced out. So Prasad's policy of questioning the co-administration of vaccines could be invoked to support changing the vaccine schedule and even forcing companies to reformulate combination vaccines such as the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. This has been a goal of anti-vaccine advocates, including Kennedy, for a long time. I think if it does happen, it would have catastrophic effects. Instead of going to the doctor 3 times over 12 to 15 months, parents would have to go a dozen or more times. I think it's likely that a lot of parents wouldn't do it. Even if parents did do it, and even if the system could kind of withstand the added burden on pediatricians to do this, kids would be vulnerable to the pathogens that they haven't been vaccinated against for, a year or a year and a half. And there have been studies that have shown that failing to co-administer some of the vaccines, for example, with measles, exposed children to measles and actually resulted in outbreaks of measles because they hadn't gotten co-administration.
Okay, Steve, let me just dial back a minute. So what I'm hearing you say is that Prasad doesn't like the evidence that the people under him or currently under him have used to authorize or approve these vaccines in their current formulations or co-administrations with other vaccines. So evidence was looked at by people at FDA and they approved it, right? And now he's coming in and saying, well, I don't like that. I'm not convinced by the evidence. How is that different than when he was saying beforehand that he didn't really like Peter Marks overruling the people under him?
Well, I've said a bunch of times since January that the hypocrisy ship in Washington sailed a long time ago. And I don't think you're going to get very far by pointing out inconsistencies and hypocrisies in public policy. But I will say that you're right, that CBER had concluded that it was safe and effective to co-administer COVID vaccines and flu and RSV vaccines. You may recall that when COVID vaccines were first received emergency use authorization, FDA said that out of an abundance of caution that they shouldn't be co-administered with other vaccines. And then they came back later and said that it's okay to do it. And CDC and other groups actually encouraged this co-administration. So and Prasad doesn't really provide any data except his own personal skepticism to support this.
But that's what I wanted to drill down on a little bit, because let's go from there to the other things you talked about. I don't know if Prasad, before he joined FDA, had raised alarms on these kinds of issues. But, there's one thing where a new leader comes in and says, going forward, this is how we're going to look at certain data. This is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to require. But how common is it for somebody to come in and say, I just want to reevaluate the way we did everything. I don't like the way the old FDA was treating statistical analyses or whatever the basis is. And so I'm going to undo previous decisions.
That's extraordinarily uncommon. And when it's done, when FDA changes its policies, in the past, that's been done through a kind of scientific consensus that's been developed. It's best when it's developed in public, when they can get input from the entire scientific community, as well as patients and other kind of stakeholders for doing it. What isn't common, what is extraordinary, is to have a center director second guess the decisions that FDA staff have made and say, no, we're changing the policy. And the FDA staff essentially learn about it from the decision memo that the center director issues. As you know, Peter Marks did it. There were a few instances of him doing that in the past. That was about specific product approval decisions. It wasn't kind of philosophically turning the policy ship around on something that's going to affect a whole class of products like vaccines.
Okay, so one more thing, and humor me. I've been away. I've been at a nephew's wedding in the UK and having a very chill time, not getting all upset about these kinds of things. And I come back and I see that the CDC has kind of imploded. And at the end of the day, what really happened there is a few people just sort of put their foot down and said no, meaning no, they'll walk out. That's how I understand this. The agency, I don't know what the future is of that agency. So do you think there's going to be a ripple effect, Steve, from CDC into FDA, maybe even into NIH? To what degree are the goings-on within each of these agencies, which all report obviously into HHS, to what degree do you think they spill from one end to the other?
I would say that it's part of a coordinated effort that's being led by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to upend, disrupt the vaccine policy of the United States. And the things that are happening at CDC, at FDA, and at NIH are all part of a coordinated effort. And it's not conspiracy thinking.
Well, I think that he's been open about that. That's not a secret.
That's not a secret.
What I guess what I'm asking is there a point at which people just are like, I can't support this anymore, I'm out of here? And publicly, I mean, we've obviously know that a whole bunch of people have gone privately. And do you think there's a tipping point is what I'm really asking?
We've passed the tipping point. And I would disagree with you a little bit. I don't think the CDC imploded. I think it was exploded. So there's a little bit of a difference there. We've seen it already at FDA, of course. Ousting Peter Marks was part of that. There have been other officials. The official who was in charge of biostatistics and post-market pharmacovigilance at CBER was pushed out of his position by Vinay Prasad and forced to take a detail at CDER, at the Center for Drugs. And Vinay Prasad has made himself acting head of that division at CBER. There's a lot of other machinations that are going on. There are other people who have been fired, who have quit, and so on. So at least when it comes to vaccines, we've certainly gone past that tipping point, and we're heading in a direction which I believe, and I think most public health experts believe, is troublesome and dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, I actually want to make a point here for our listeners, which is regardless of people's political opinion, we try very, very hard at BioCentury to tell it straight. We look for the science-based alternative argument that could support something. I know that there are some people who will say great things are happening at FDA and certain interactions with biotechs and things. But I think that just what we're seeing on the vaccine front alone, in terms of scientific orthodoxy or scientific rigor, really, really hard. You know, this is not necessarily a party political thing, really, really hard. At some point, you've just got to stand up and say, this is wrong. It's just not possible for us to find a science-based approach that supports this. Well, that was cheery. Where are we going now, Jeff?
Let's talk about Medicare. There we go. Steve, you've been digging into the effects of changes to the Medicare drug negotiation program that were included in that tax and budget bill Congress passed in July. What have you found?
So that bill, which people call the big beautiful bill, it included an expansion of the orphan drug exemption from the Medicare drug price negotiation program. You recall the original bill, the IRA that created the price negotiation program, created an exemption for orphan drugs, but was only if a drug had a single orphan designation that it was exempt from the IRA. That had a lot of unanticipated consequences. It led to companies saying that they were abandoning some orphan indications because they didn't want to have a second or a third orphan indication that would then trigger Medicare drug price negotiations. Some big pharmas said that they were deprioritizing orphan cancer indications in favor of more common indications, and so on. So there were a lot of unintended consequences as a result of that. Now, what in the new legislation, what they've done is they've said if a drug only has orphan indications, regardless of the number, it's exempt from Medicare drug price negotiation. And if its first indication is an orphan indication, if it subsequently later, if it later gets a non-orphan indication, the timing for when it's eligible for Medicare drug price negotiation, that clock starts ticking with the first non-orphan indication. So limiting the exemption in the original law kind of instantly and unintentionally destroyed one business model for rare disease drug development. In this model, manufacturers piece together multiple small indications that are each too small to justify investments in R&D. What they do is they pursue multiple small indications, put together a package of them in the expectation that altogether there'll be enough return on the drug to justify the R&D. This is good for those small companies that do that. It's typically small companies. And of course, it's very good for the patients who have those orphan diseases. So in broadening the orphan exemption, Congress has again made that business model viable again. The other thing that it's done, though, and by all accounts, this was unanticipated by most of the lawmakers who were working on this and also by the companies that were pushing for this change in the law, it's going to delay price negotiations for some blockbuster drugs. The most obvious examples are Keytruda from Merck and Opdivo from Bristol Myers. Both of those drugs were first approved for an orphan indication, and then a year later, they were approved for non-orphan indications. That means that the first date that they are going to be eligible for Medicare drug price negotiation has been put back by a year for each of those. I've got a story that's going to be coming out this week describing other examples of drugs that are going to have delayed price negotiation and also that may never be subject to price negotiation because they have multiple orphan indications. And as long as their manufacturers don't get approval for non-orphan indication, then they will be exempt from price negotiation forever. The other thing that I'd say that's interesting that's happened as a result of this change is we're very likely to see changes in the pipeline prioritization of pharmas. They're going to shift back to the pre-IRA model where they're going to go first with orphan indications, especially for cancer drugs. There's going to be a temptation to either only have orphan indications, in which case your drugs would never be subject to the Medicare drug price negotiation, or to push off the non-orphan indication until later in the drug's life cycle so that you can extend your runway before negotiations. One final thing here that's interesting, it's another kind of unintended consequence of this, is I think that we're going to see, to an extent, this supports higher launch prices, right? Because if a drug launches first for an orphan indication, typically pricing is higher and the manufacturers justify that higher pricing because there's going to be a limited market. It's an orphan market, right? Then when they get a non-orphan indication, here's what doesn't happen. What doesn't happen typically is the manufacturer looking at it and saying, oh, now I've got a non-orphan indication. I've got a much bigger market, so I'm going to lower the price. That just isn't a thing. So these are all kind of things to think about.
All right, Steve, thanks for that update. Look out for Steve's story on BioCentury.com. And if you're liking what you're hearing, subscribe, follow us, leave us a review. We'd love to hear from you. And Simone, you didn't mention that in addition to the buzz cut, your man Alcaraz is going for a hot pink sleeveless top with purple shorts and purple shoes. And I gotta say, Wimbledon organizers, take note. A little more colorful. All right. Well, we'll be back with our sister podcast later this week. Steve and Simone digging deep into our back to school issue. We'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in. And we appreciate Kendall Square Orchestra, which produces the music for all of BioCentury's podcasts.